All right, here we are. There we go. Okay, and I think I've got it on mute. All right. Hello, everybody. Hello. Sorry I am late. Time ran away with me. Hello, Rise and Ability. Hello, Justice. Justice says tonight should be good. God, I hope so. Ryzen is here and says, is there a sold-out show or are there still tickets up for grabs? Yes, sir, there are still tickets up for grabs. So, yeah, I wanted to talk about the concept of sin because I think it was last weekend or weekend before, I'm not sure, was Pentecost. And Pentecost is the first fruits festival that they have. And if you look in the book of Acts, this is when the Holy Spirit descends upon the, I'm losing my words because of migraine, the followers of Christ, the apostles. And they start speaking in tongues and they appear drunk. We call it drunk on the Holy Spirit. And people are saying they're drunk. And it's like, no, it's 9:00 in the morning. They're not drunk. Shaman's here too. Hey, Shaman. Right on. Glad to have you here. I'm glad we have at least this many people because, it's Memorial Day weekend and I didn't think anybody was going to show. So the apostles started speaking in tongues and other people could understand them as if it was in their own native language. And the apostles couldn't speak that language. They didn't even know what they were saying, but other people could understand them. And so this is seen as the beginning of the Christian church. This is after Christ's death, when the apostles were just on their own. And so if you want to learn about the really, really early Christian church, you just have to look to the book of Acts, which is absolutely wonderful. They lose their leader and how are they going to carry on? Where's the proof? Where's this, singing? Where's this power? Christ had all this power to do all this healing and everything like that. How is the church going to carry on without him? And well, the Holy Spirit landed on the apostles. Now, the interesting thing is, and this is what most of, tonight's show is going to be about, except for the Jordan Peterson stuff, of course, is the concept of sin. Now, normally you think of the word sin and you think of something that is really bad that you're not supposed to do and you're a bad person if you do it and da-da-da-da-da. But sin is a term that comes from archery, and it just means to miss the mark. It's whatever you're aiming at, you just are off center for whatever reason. And when I found that out, that took so much of the pressure off. And I loved learning about that. So Ryzen says, then the act of the Holy Spirit coming upon the apostles to help them understand the different tongues. Yep, Christ also said that we would go on to do greater works even after he. Yes. Oh, Mary Lou is taking care of poor Sam, who is very upset that I'm online right now. And if you think about it, the rise of all of modern Western civilization and even part of Eastern civilization, the abolishment of slavery, the idea of human rights and individual rights, not group rights, because even in the Roman Empire, rights were granted to you as a group. You were the plebeian, you were the senatori, you were whatever caste. We got rid of the caste society and we got it down to the individual based on Christ. The whole idea of being innocent before guilty comes from the Bible. And all of these wonderful things that we understand as modern morality come from the Christian tradition. And that's one of the reasons why I turned back to the church, why I rediscovered my faith, is discovering that all of these things that I took for granted as part of Western morality the idea of the individual, the idea of innocent before proven guilty, the idea of being judged by your peers and not people that are better than you, but people who understand your way of life. All of that comes from the Christian tradition. And it's just to realize that all of that comes from Christianity. I realized I had to learn more about Christianity. So Ryzen says, hello, Mary Lou. I hope you are doing well. So she's laughing and smiling. She is doing well. It's been very rainy here. It got suddenly cool here. It was only a high of 66 here today. So this weekend is going to be really cool. Not really time for barbecue or anything like that, but good for gardening. And Shaman says, Christ was like the stone tossed upon the water. We are the ripples. Absolutely. Absolutely. And Shaman also says, hello, Mary Lou. I wish I had the Mary Lou cam set up. But yeah, I was running late. I'm so sorry. But right there, that was a sin of mine. I missed the mark. The mark was 7:30 and I showed up a little late. So sin isn't this big, awful, heavy thing, like in a lot of the Samson, high-pitched whining is not going to get you anything. Shh, puppy, shh. They say like sin is the wages of death and scary things like that. And it's like, no, it's just not, you had an intention. You wanted to go to this place, you wanted to be this kind of person and you just missed the mark. And that's why they say, we are all full of sin. There's not a single one of us who is without sin. That whole thing about the stoning of the woman who was brought forth as a prostitute. And Jesus says, who among you has not sinned? Who among you has not missed the mark? And not a single person can say that. Not a single person can say that on this earth. From the time we're little children, I mean, even if you don't count the time as children, even if you start the counting from 18 and up, how many of us can say that we were perfect and we accomplished everything that we set out to do? Every single time that we aimed upon a thing, we struck that bullseye center. How many of us can say that? No one. You'd have to not aim to be able to say, and who can't, I mean, you wake up in the morning, you aim to have breakfast, you aim to have lunch, you aim to get through your day. I mean, there's not a single one among us who hasn't sinned. So Justice says, I'm here getting super stoned before my surgery on the 9th. Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. Smoke a bowl for me because I can't. And I will mark that down. Let me get up my phone so I can put that down. Ooh, now the dogs are going to go off. I will put that in my calendar to pray for you on the 9th, Justice. I have a ketamine infusion on the 1st. Pray for Justice. Surgery. And I will make sure to remind everybody to do that as we go on through the weeks. So Shaman says, sending prayers and blessings for your surgery, Justice. Justice says, I've been talking myself out of sin daily. We all do it. Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, because there's temptation everywhere. There's temptation in that chocolate bar. there's temptation in staying up late to watch that show. There's temptation in the, I can just have one more hit when we know we're done. It has nothing to do with any sort of evil or anything like that. It's an aim and we miss the mark. So everybody does it. Come on, Sam, it's okay. Wow, the dogs are really rambunctious tonight. I don't know what's up. It may be the weather. I don't know. But yeah, it's hold on a second. Samson, you have food. If not, you can wait till the break. Now he's gonna go and bark. The windows are open now. Finally, on the high plains where I'm at, and where like Lauren says, spring comes to us much later. Memorial Day is a time for us when we know that we can safely put out our plants in the garden. That doesn't always hold true because it's snowed here in June and July, so May isn't always safe, but we go with it's the general time when you can put your plants out safely. Justice says, I talked myself out of buying candy just an hour ago. Yep. I know exactly that. And even the dogs, if they had their way, they would be getting TREATS all the time, all day long. And I can't afford to feed them like that. And it's not good for their waistlines. So, it's something among all of us that we can just fall short. We can fall short. And it's not anything that's bad within us. Oh, speaking of Lawrence, here he is. Hi, Lawrence. How you doing? So, Justice says, hi, Bam. Good. Glad. So yeah, it takes all that judgy sort of criticism that can really tear us down. Justice says, Lawrence, my hand's typed, Pam. Yeah, it's all good. I know what you meant. But see, right there, you missed the mark. You had one intention to type one thing, and you didn't type that. So that is a sin. It's not a moral sin, but it certainly is a sin in missing the mark. So Latin Patriot says, hi, Pam, Lawrence, Justice, and whoever else is in the house. We got Shaman in the house. We got Rise and Ability in the house. So Latin Patriot also says hi to you all. And we also have Mary Lou in the house. So she's over here smiling and laughing at me and paying good attention to my dogs. So, but yeah, it's when I learned that sin was just missing the mark, it took all the big heavy weight out of it. And it made me realize, oh, okay. It's just falling short of what I want. And I know I feel bad when I fall short from what I want. So, I don't need to beat myself up so badly when it's a quote unquote biblical sin, that sort of thing. I don't need to think that, people thinking badly of me. Oh, you're a sinner. We're gonna look down your nose at you and all that other stuff. She's just nesting. It's okay. Free's playing with the blankets on the couch. It's not that Saturday Night Live skit with the church lady. I don't know how many of you youngins know that. Was that Dana Carvey? I think it was Dana Carvey. Could it be Satan? I can't do the face. It was marvelous. But that kind of heavy judgment stuff that I grew up with as a kid, that just drove me away. That so many people these days, so many young people these days are rebelling against. That authority. Well, you're old enough to remember the church lady, Lawrence. He says he remembers the church lady. I'm thinking more like Justice. I don't know if Justice has ever seen the church lady. But people in our generation definitely have. Um, and it was just, the pursed lips and the shaking finger and all of that. And, the LGBTQ community rejecting, so many in that community rejecting Christian morality and things like that because they think that sin is some kind of judgment, and that, people are just going to get all huffy and puffy if they find out that you're that sort of persuasion, that sort of thing. And it's just, you know, the people who do that are too self-righteous in my book. There's no way that they live a life sinless enough to make that kind of judgment. Shaman says, yet the without sin cast the first stone, and no one did. Exactly. So yeah, I mean, for us to all go running around judging everybody else or feeling like we're being judged or any of that, we can just throw out the window. We can just throw that out the window because we're all sinners. Nobody's sin is greater than anybody else's. All of it just means to miss the mark. Lawrence says, yes, some people told me because I am gay, I'm going straight to hell, even though I am celibate and I have no desire for sex. Exactly. I mean, that whole idea of going to hell because you sin. No, Jesus died for our sins. That's the whole point, is that, you're not going to hell because you're gay any more than I'm going to hell because I have a hard time quitting smoking. There's no difference between the two sins. They're both missing the mark, and neither one of us is going to hell because Jesus is the great Redeemer. Jesus redeemed all of us, past, present, and future, from our sins. We all have the ability to be a part of God, to have God walk with us, to be of God's work, bringing his holy kingdom here down on earth, and going to heaven when we die because of Jesus, the way, the truth, and the light. The light to see that we are freed, from our sin. No matter how much we may feel guilty, no matter how much other people may feel guilty, Christ has redeemed us. And the truth of that being that, he has paid our ticket into heaven, every single one of us. All we have to do is choose, to be followers of Christ. And that doesn't mean getting heavy into the Bible or getting heavy into spiritual studies or any of that. To a certain extent, you don't even need to attend church. That's not necessary. It's just you say that you are a follower of Christ and you believe that Christ died for your sins. That is the way into heaven. That is the truth of spirituality, is that, we all have a way into heaven regardless of our sin. Even the mass murderer has a way into heaven. And that, it shocks us. It shocks us to think that the Emperor Constantine, after all the evils he made down on earth, as far as the treatment of his citizens and whatnot, being a deathbed conversion, he had a way into heaven, because the rules according to everlasting life are not the same rules that we have here on earth. It's a lot different, and it's a lot more forgiving. And if we had the spiritual insight that Jesus had, we would understand why we would still forgive, no matter how bad it made us feel, no matter how angry we were, no matter how fill in the blank, you know, we would understand, if we had Jesus's understanding of spirituality, that they are forgiven and even they have a ticket into heaven. So Lauren says, yes, I am a follower of Christ, and we are having church right now. Absolutely, absolutely. When two or more are gathered in my name, if it's just you and one other person praying in the name of Christ, that is having a church service. That's all that's required. It doesn't have to be this big fancy thing. At the beginning of the church, the beginning of the Christian church, they didn't have any cathedrals. They didn't have any stained glass windows or altars or giant crucifixes or any of that. They met in caves by candlelight. They didn't even have a Bible, but they were Christians. They were followers of Christ. And it's the whole idea that because, not a single one of us is perfect, not a single one of us is without sin, that we all miss the mark, that we should forgive, and allow second chances and allow people to try and do better the next time. You know what I mean? Shaman says, I believe too that the original translations was more along, it is not our standard custom in Jewish community to be gay, but it is not really a sin. There's another thing about the translation that I've heard, and I'm not a biblical scholar, so I don't know how true this is, but what they were talking about in, say, Leviticus was not about having sex with the same sex. It was about having sex with children. And that was the big no-no. But it got changed in later translations to call out homosexual sex. So homosexual sex may not even be a condemnation in the Bible. It may be that it was just pedophilia that they were writing against, which, I think all of us here can understand. So Shaman says, I like this Pam Church. Oh, good. Me too. Lawrence says, so true. I must say that some of those cathedrals are so beautiful. Yes. Oh my gosh. And there's one in St. Louis that is, the mosaics in there are unbelievable. Just gold tiles that shine in the candlelight, and going there for like a midnight mass for Christmas is just, it would take your breath away. I mean, a lot of people who didn't even consider themselves Christians, let alone Catholic, would go to the midnight Christmas service at that cathedral because it was so stunning. It was so beautiful. So yeah. And Shaman says, that's an interesting concept. I like it. Right. I think that's something that we can more understand than going against heterosexual sex or homosexual sex, because that seems, we don't have it tied to a gene yet, but that it does seem more of something that people are born with rather than a choice. And there were a lot of things that people considered moral failings, like alcoholism and things like that, drug addiction, that we now understand are absolutely tied into your DNA, and that these people don't have a choice in the matter. They have a choice in how to deal with it, but not in whether or not they have that predisposed biology. So, Lauren says, I remember going to the cathedral with my mom and Helena. It was very beautiful. I bet. So, but anyway, we were on, we were starting on Biblical Series 7, Walking with God, Noah and the Flood. Do y'all want to get into that now? We've talked about a half an hour on sin and how it's not as heavy a concept as we may have been raised to believe, or maybe it was just the way. I don't know. I know that this was very true the way that I was raised in my generation. I don't know how much it is these generations, because the separation from the church following the 70s, 1970s, that was, there are a lot of people who aren't raised with church at all these days. And they don't realize that their morality comes from Christianity, Old Testament as well as New. It isn't all about Christ teachings. It's also about ancient Jewish teachings. The whole thing of Sodom and Gomorrah, that was all about, innocent until proven guilty. If you find 10 innocent people in that town, God's judgment won't rain down. The whole idea that our justice system has of, we want to err on the side of letting guilty people go, on so that we can avoid locking that one innocent person up. There's a Ben Franklin quote to that. Sort of let 100 guilty people go free so that one innocent person isn't locked up. And that's something that I strongly believe in as well, because a lot of people who are guilty of crimes go on to redeem themselves, and prison these days doesn't allow much of redemption, and sending innocent people to prison it's not something we want to do. But so many people would rather punish. And psychologically, we're bent towards this. There are a lot of psychological studies that talk about, we will sacrifice our own earnings to be able to punish somebody who breaks the rules. I'll try and find, I think it was Freakonomics that they talked about that. And they left out some of the conclusions that you could draw from that experiment. But if there was one rule breaker in a group of 10, the other 9 people would each give $1 out of their earnings to punish the one rule breaker. But it doesn't go to say, well, what if that person didn't break the rules? They were only accused of it. And it also didn't say that when you have 9 people, giving $1 each to punish that rule breaker, then the person with the most money at the table is actually the so-called police of the game. And you end up with a tyrant that has more resources to come after you or anybody in the game. It's just absolutely fascinating how these small psychological experiments explain, why we have a system the way it is now. If a lot of people think that if you're even arrested and thrown in jail, before you have the court case, just because you have to show up in court, that means that you're guilty. They wouldn't go after you if it wasn't true, sort of idea. And then the other problem of, the court system, the prosecutors have all the time, money, and power they need to go after you, but you, the possibly innocent person who's the defendant, has limited income, has limited power, has limited resources, has limited time to be able to mount a defense. And so you see that the prosecutors who are seen as the quote unquote good guys can often be the tyrants who are just, beating little people up. Little people by comparison. I mean, I'm talking people bigger than us, people who are doctors, and have millions of dollars to their name. Well, millions of dollars in the face of the taxpayers, then you're talking billions of dollars. So you've got your poor little measly millions against their billions. You're screwed. So it's often really, really difficult to mount a defense against the state when the state comes after you, even if you're innocent. And people will think you're guilty anyway. It's just, that's why I applaud defense attorneys everywhere. A lot of people have a very negative view of defense attorneys because, oh, wow, you're defending criminals. You're just helping criminals go free. No, you're helping innocent people go and resist against a tyrannical state. Yeah, we may not think the state is tyrannical, but that's only because they're not coming after us right now. That would change in a heartbeat if they were to come after us, and we'd be on the receiving end and want support and not get it. And it's just breaks my heart. But anyway, let's talk about that kind of chaos that can come into your life. We are going to go to Jordan Peterson, Biblical Studies 7, Walking with God, Noah and the Flood. And they say that this is the corrected version. I don't know what was corrected here. Maybe one of the slides that they show, but we will check it out.
Thank you. So I looked today, and these lectures have now been they've been viewed 1 million times. So that's pretty amazing, really.
More than that now.
Or they've been glanced at 1 million times. That might.
This video alone has 276,991 views. So almost 1.3 million views on this individual video alone.
That's also possible. All right, so let's get right into it. So last week, I think was mostly remarkable for the absolute dearth of content that was actually biblically related. So that was, I'll just recap what I laid out, and so that it sets the frame properly for what we're going to discuss tonight. And I presented you with an elaborated description of this diagram, essentially, which I spent quite a lot of time formulating, probably about 25 years ago, I guess, which kind of accounts for its graphic primitiveness, I suppose. I was really pushing the limits of my 486 computer to produce that, I can tell you. So, and it's a description, a representation of the archetypal circumstances of life. And the archetypal circumstances are the circumstances that are true under all conditions for all time. And so you can think about them as descriptively characteristic of the nature of human experience. That's not exactly the same as the nature of reality.
Yes.
But because you can divide reality into its subjective and objective elements, and there's utility in doing that. But these sorts of representations don't play that game. They consider human experience as constitutive of reality. And that's how we experience it. And so we'll just go with that. The idea basically is that we always exist inside a damaged structure. And that structure is partly biological, and it's partly sociocultural. It's partly what's been handed to us by our ancestors, both practically in terms of infrastructure, but also psychologically in terms of the
rules,
active learned content of our psyches. And so that would include, for example, our ability to utilize language and the words that we use and the phrases that we use and the mutual understanding that we develop as a consequence of interacting with each other. Archetypally speaking, that structure is always dead and corrupt.
Yep.
And the reason it's dead is because it was made by people who are dead. And the reason it's corrupt is because things fall apart of their own accord. And the fact that people don't aim properly, let's say, speeds along that process of degeneration. And so what that means, and I think this is something worth knowing. Maybe I'll try standing back here and see if that problem goes away.
I think we've watched this one, haven't we? Are we on lecture series 8? I think we may be. Hold on a second. Let me look at this. So, excuse me for a moment. Yeah. YouTube. Here we go to YouTube. Now we go to oh, come on. Search in there. Jordan Peterson. Biblical Series 8. I think we're on 8. Oh, maybe not. 6 was, because I remember him standing back like that and saying, would this work better? Hold on, let me go to the end of this and see if. No, we didn't get through this. Okay. We got here. Did we get to this? Let me know, folks. I don't think, I thought we got to that picture before. Am I off? Do you guys remember seeing that picture? So I think I've shown that picture before in one of our series. We may be going in circles here. Oh, I'm ill prepared today. So, but let's go back to, where were we? We were here, past there.
Element of the mind that believes that it can twist and bend its insufficiency has the capability to conquer chaos, despite the danger of that. That's the other thing, because the fact that you're fragile is actually a precondition for your heroism, because if you weren't fragile, then there'd be nothing heroic about doing something difficult, right? Because if you couldn't be hurt or damaged or defeated or end up in failure, then where's the moral courage in the endeavor? It has to be that the fragility is built into the courage. And so it's not a reason not to engage in it at all. In fact, quite the contrary. And so, well, and so then, what do? Well, you put the city back together, and maybe the way you want it, so that it's functional and efficient and beautiful, and so that people can flourish there, and flourish in a manner that makes them what would you say? That makes them feel that the unbearable catastrophe of being is worth it for the experience. That's what you're aiming at. And it's not an impossibility. It's not an impossibility. And then not only that, not only do you repair the city when you do that, but you make yourself the sort of thing that continually repairs the city. And that's even better. That's the end goal, because it's not the repair of the city that's the goal. It's the transformation of yourself into the thing that continually repairs the city.
Hey, Floki's joined us. Thank you for being here. I haven't seen you in a long time. It's good to have you here. Latin says, I wish Jordan Peterson would lounge shirtless by the pool and talk to us like with some sort of music in the background. That would be awesome. That would be awesome. Yeah, it's profound to have the shipbuilder here when we're going over Noah, isn't it? And I do think maybe Jordanson has covered these same kind of things before. Maybe we are going over territory again, but I don't remember getting to the part where it was actually the knock and the door will be open to you. So I think we're on the right video. I'm not sure, but if you guys think that we're going over the same territory again, let me know and we'll move forward. But I think we're in the right spot now.
And so there's just no reason for that not to happen. And the more it can happen, the better.
Yeah.
Well, there's an undercurrent to this story, and that is also the story of the flood. And that's the fact that the city can become corrupt because people don't engage in heroic endeavor, or perhaps because they engage in precisely the opposite of that, which is outright destructive behavior. And this is also something that's worth considering too, because if you consider your own manner of being, you can say things to people like tell the truth and be good, and those are cliches, obviously, right. And so they lack power because they're cliches, but you can take them apart and utilize them in a manner that stops being a cliche. And you do that by being more humble about them, I would say, because maybe you can't tell the truth because you don't know what the truth is. But one thing you can do is you can stop saying things that you know to be untrue. And you might say, well, how do I know that they're untrue? And the answer to that is, well, you need a whole philosophy of truth, the elaboration of an entire philosophy of truth to answer that question. And so we're not going to bother answering that question because in some sense at the moment it's beside the point. That isn't the issue. The issue is there are times in your life where you know that the thing that you're saying is not true. It's a deception. It's a lie of some sort, and you're using it to manipulate yourself or another person or the world. And you're also fully possessed of the idea that you can get away with it. And there's a satanic arrogance about that. In fact, that is the archetypal arrogance that's portrayed in the mythological character of Satan, because Satan is precisely the archetype of the element of the mind that believes that it can twist and bend the structure of reality without paying the price for that. And you can't imagine anything that's more arrogant than that, because really, you really think that you can twist the structure of a reality and that's going to work out for you without it snapping back. It's so
obvious. I'm going to finish his sentence there. And that's what I was opening up with the concept of sin, is that, the sinister part of it, see, there's a word, sinister, that starts with sin. The sinister part of it is that we think we can get away with it. That's the problem a lot of times with missing the mark, is that we're doing it on purpose because we think we can get away with it. And that's where it really gets into that corruptive state that is malevolent, let's say. I won't go into saying it's satanic, but it is of that original archetype of Satan being the one that corrupts, the snake in the garden that corrupts the words of God, saying, oh, no, you won't die. Yeah, but yes, you will die, because you will die to God. You will no longer be able to walk in the presence of God. You'll be dead. As far as God is concerned, you'll be dead. You'll have to be separated from him. And so that sort of twisting and warping of reality, thinking that you can eat the apple and get away with it. Yeah, that's missing the mark. And yeah, what Shaman says, the evil intention of it all. Exactly. So, and we have to beware of our own evil intentions. I mean, it may be as slight as, oh, I don't want to be punished for eating the cookie from the cookie jar that mom told me not to take more than, the one cookie that she gave me a day. It could be as innocent as that, but still as corruptive, still as evil as taking the apple from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. You know, and to think that it won't come back to haunt us, that it won't come back to bite us in the butt, it is just arrogant and naive. Both of those things in combination, which is a terrible combination.
Obvious that can't work, that everyone knows it. But anyways, back to the initial point, is that you know by the rules of the game that you yourself are playing, that some of the times you're violating the rules of the game that you're playing.
Yes.
And the first issue with regards to, say, stating the truth or behaving in a responsible manner would be merely stop cheating at whatever game it is that you've chosen to play. That's a good start, and that'll straighten out your life. It'll start to straighten out your life. And so, well, the flood. How does the flood tie into this? Well, you know, we live in a corrupt structure. We're corrupt as individuals. We live in a corrupt structure, and part of that corruption is just happenstance. It's the way things fall apart. But the other part of it is that not only are we not aiming up, we're actually aiming down. And the flood story is a warning, and it's a very clear warning. And the warning is, if you aim down enough, and then if enough of you aim down at the same time, everything will degenerate into something that's indistinguishable from the chaos from which things emerged at the beginning of time. It's something like that, because the cosmos that's presented in mythological representations is chaos versus order, right? The order is on top, you might say, and the chaos is always underneath. And the chaos can break through, or the order can crumble, and you can fall into the chaos, and that chaos is intermingled potential. And the way that you destroy the order and let the chaos rise back up, which is exactly how it's portrayed in the flood story, is by inhabiting the corpse of your father. That's one mythological motif. And feeding on the remains, and with no gratitude and no attempt to replenish what it is that you're taking from. And the warning in the flood story is, don't do that for very long, because things will happen that are so awful you cannot possibly imagine it. And that'll happen to you personally, and it'll happen to your family, and it'll happen to your community, and it's happened to people over and over throughout history. And it's quite interesting, you know, it's very soon after the story of Cain and Abel, when you see evil enter the world in the story of Adam and Eve, along with self-consciousness. And evil there is the ability, that's the knowledge of good and evil, that's the ability to hurt other people self-consciously, to know what you're doing. And then, of course, instantly, Cain takes that to the absolute extreme, and he uses that capacity to destroy really what he loves best. He gets as close as a human being can to destroying the divine ideal, because, of course, his brother is Abel, and Abel is favored by God, and Cain destroys him, which Cain tells God at the end of that episode that his punishment is more than he can bear. And I think the reason for that is, where are you once you destroy your own ideal? What's left for you?
And this ties into what Floki is saying, is that it all comes down to your morals. Floki, you missed the earlier commentary that we had on sin, about sin is a term from archery, meaning to miss the mark, and how, you know, all throughout my growing up, I thought that I took for granted the morality that I had learned from Western civilization, and that all of that morality is based in Christianity and the biblical studies and things like that. And that missing the mark in my own reality, or in my own morals, is sinning. You know, I know when I've broken the rules. And I know that I've missed the mark in who I want to be and what I want to be when I violate my own morality. And that, you know, it takes a lot of the nasty connotations out of it by just calling it a missing of the mark. And it all, it boils down to our morality, but our morality we get from Christianity. Western civilization gets its morality from Christianity, and the early Judaism stories beyond that. So all of this comes down to, missing the mark as displayed in these biblical stories.
There's nowhere to go. There's no up. And when there's no up, there's a lot of down.
Yes.
And, you know, there's an idea that was put forth very nicely in Milton's Paradise Lost when he was describing, from a psychological perspective, essentially what hell is. And hell is, you're in hell to the degree that you're distant from the good. That might be a good way of thinking about it. And if you destroy your own ideal, which you do with jealousy and resentment and the desire to pull down people who you would like to be, let's say, then you end up in a situation that's indistinguishable from hell.
Yep.
And the way the biblical story unfolds as well, it's Cain, and then it's the flood. And so Cain adopts this mode of being that's antithetical to being itself, at least to positive being itself. He does it voluntarily. He does it knowing full well what he's doing. And the net consequence of this, that as it ripples through the entire social structure, is that God stands back and says, this whole thing has got so bad, the only thing we can do is swipe it to the ground.
That's the etch-a-sketch, you know, God going, oh, I made a mistake, and just etch-a-sketching the world.
And that is no joke. That's exactly how things work. And one of the things that's extraordinarily terrifying about that sequence of stories, and I believe this to be true, I think I realized this independently of any of the analysis that I was doing of mythological stories, because I looked at what happened in places like the Soviet Union and Maoist China and in Nazi Germany, and the most penetrating observers of those societies, the people who were most interested in how it was that those absolute catastrophes came about, all said the same thing. It was rooted in the degeneration of the individuals who made up the society.
Boom.
You know, you hear, well, people were following orders. It's like, no, that explanation doesn't hold water. Or that you'd be punished if you resisted. Well, there was some truth in that, but nowhere near as much as people might think, especially at the beginnings of the process. More it was that people decided, each and every one of them, to turn a blind eye to the catastrophes and to participate in the lies.
And that's it, participating in the lies. Not looking at the catastrophe that was coming, that they were being an active part in. Turning a blind eye to what you're doing. You know, missing the mark, sinning is one thing, but then turning a blind eye to it, turning a blind eye to your morality. Ooh, that brings the flood really quick.
And that warped the entire societies, and they went, you know, they veered their way downward to something as closely approximating hell as you could hope to manage, especially in places like Nazi Germany and, well, in all three of those
Maoist
places,
China, yeah.
In Maoist China and in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
So the thing that's so frightening about, one of the things that's so frightening about the stories in Genesis is they say something very clear, which is that your moral degeneration contributes in no small way to the degeneration of the entire cosmos.
Yes.
You say, well, I would like my life to be meaningful. People say that. Really, would you? Really? You really would like your life to be meaningful? You think maybe people would trade a little nihilism to not have to face that particular realization? And I think people do that all the time. It's a terrible weight to realize. But we are networked together. That's the price of, or let's say that's the vulnerability that's associated with our intense capacity to communicate.
This is, if you want a really, really good short story on this, check out, what's his name? He does the Forged Coupon. It's Russian writer. What's the Russian writer? It's not Nabokov. Tolstoy's The Forged Coupon. And it talks about how one little sin of missing the mark, this guy takes a coupon, because the way that money worked back then, it wasn't pre-printed stuff. Well, it was, but oftentimes there was a blank where you filled in the amount. They had this in England as well. And they changed they forged the coupon for, say, $50 to make it $500. And they passed it off to a merchant. And then the merchant realized that it was forged and that he had just given away a ton of money. And now he's now he's stuck holding this counterfeit bill. Well, then that gets passed on, and you see the ripple effect through society until it ends up with a murder. And the woman, as she's being murdered by this guy who is the end result of this, just this ripple out of corruption throughout the society, she says one phrase before she dies, and it flips it all around. And that is, she says to her own murderer, "I forgive you." And that then creates a different ripple effect that goes out throughout the society that puts it on a positive swing. So TC Irish is in the house. Yay! Just swinging by to say hi, and all a great night. Well, thank you, DC Irish. I appreciate you swinging in. Hit the like button on your way out. I appreciate it. You have a good night. So yeah, if you guys, it's a very short story. It's more of a novella. It doesn't take long to read, but it's really powerful. Tolstoy's The Forged Coupon, and how one individual act just, because we're all interconnected. It's not like one person getting away with something and the story goes on. No, it's one person's action leading to another person's misfortune, leading to another person's misfortune, and it just goes on. It's a beautiful story. Check it out from the library. They'll have it. It's great. So DC Irish as always. So cool. All right, back to Jordan here.
And it is certainly possible that the ripples of our individual actions have consequences that are far beyond the limits of our immediate consciousness. And yes. I also think people know that too. They know that in the way that people know things when they don't want to know them, which means they know them embodied. They can feel them. They can sense them. They have an emotional response to them. But there's no damn way they're going to let them become articulate because they don't want to know. And when you're feeling guilty and ashamed about the things you've done or not done, and I know that can get out of hand as well, it's often because there is a crooked little part of you that's aiming at the worst possible outcome. One of the things Jung said about the shadow, that Jung's famous idea that everyone has a dark side and that dark side needs to be incorporated and made conscious. Jung said that the shadow of the human being reaches all the way to hell. And that's the thing that's so interesting about reading Carl Jung, is he actually means what he says. It's not a metaphor. It's like the part of you that's twisted against being is aligned with the part of the cosmos, let's say, the conscious cosmos, that's aiming at making everything as terrible as it can possibly be.
Yes.
And, it's a terrible shock to realize that. It's partly why people don't realize it. It's something that people keep at an arm's length.
Yeah,
it's the same as recognizing yourself as a Nazi concentration camp guard, which is a very useful exercise because there's absolutely no reason why you couldn't have been or still could be one. So, and if you think otherwise, then all the more reason for assuming that you would be unable to resist the temptation if it was in fact offered to you. And if you don't think it's a temptation, then there's so much that you don't know about human beings that you're not even in the game. Because if it wasn't a temptation, then people bloody well wouldn't have done it. And plenty of people did it, and it's no wonder. So. So things get serious in Genesis very, very rapidly. and the depth of the seriousness is ultimate, archetypal. It gets as serious as it can get.
The destruction of the whole world.
The story of Noah and the flood opens in a fragmentary manner, and I believe that these passages are part of a longer story that we only have bits and pieces of, and also one that's fragmented in its parts of more than one story. And it starts like this. It came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born.
Oh yeah, we did talk about this.
Saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Now,
The
there's an idea
Nephilim.
there. There's two ways of looking at the past. You can kind of see that in the political landscape that we inhabit now. On the more conservative end of the spectrum, people regard the past as the land of giants, right? They were the heroes of the past who established the current conditions that we exist in. And then the people on the left are more concerned perhaps with the, what would you call it, with the lineage of corruption that's come down through the centuries. And both of those perspectives are accurate. You can say, well, there were the great heroes of the past who established our modes of being. You can think of them as composite beings if you want. That's fine. That's a perfectly reasonable way of thinking about it. And you can also think of the accumulation of corruption and evil that's come along the centuries as well.
With them.
You see both of those reflected in these initial few lines. That the sons of gods, so those are the heroes, saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives, of all of which they chose. Then this statement
Dovetails.
comes in as somewhat of a non sequitur. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he is also flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. I looked at a variety of interpretations of that line because it doesn't seem to follow so clearly from the previous line, and exactly what it means isn't obvious, but it seems to be, the first line talks about the heroes of the past, and the second line says, wait a second, there's something corrupt about the human mode of being. And one of the consequences of that, as far as God is concerned, is that there are conditions under which the divine spirit will not strive with man. What that means is there are conditions under which, let's say, I don't think there's any other way of putting it, is the divine impulse towards the good will abandon you because of things that you've done.
Yeah.
And then the secondary consideration here is that perhaps because of the degeneration of people, it's not so obvious here that our lifespans are limited.
And also he's using, this is a panel from Hieronymus Bosch, I believe. He does paradise, purgatory, and hell. And this is I used to look at these all the time when I was a little kid because they were just so frightening. And this is a picture of hell here. So I don't think Jordan mentions that.
That the spirit that inhabits us will only do so for a limited amount of time. And that's tangled in a strange way in with the idea of human moral culpability. And that's posed against the notion of the giants of the past. And then it returns to the giant idea. The narrative returns to the giant idea and reads, there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of men came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, and the same became mighty men which are of old, men of renown. And that's the end of that sequence of fragments. It's very broken, but you can see a dual narrative underneath it. And one of the narratives is that there's the kind of corruption, despite the nature of the giants of the past, there's the kind of corruption lurking that would cause God to withhold his grace and allow men to deteriorate.
There's a line in the Firefly series where they go to, I think it's Mudville or Mudtown or something like that. It's looking in on Jane's past. And Mal comforts Jane by telling him, there's no statue ever been made of a man who wasn't a son of a bitch in one way or another, and that is that with the ability to be a great power like that usually comes some very nasty sort of things that we just kind of overlook, because their accomplishments were so great. And I love that line. If you look at a statue of somebody, that there were skeletons in their closet, and maybe not so much skeletons. Maybe these things were well known that they were a son of a bitch in one way or another. So.
And that sets the stage for Noah and the flood. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. one of the things I really didn't like about going to church when I was a kid, I went to a pretty moderate church. It was the United Church, which has hardly even become a church now. It's so moderate, so to speak. One of the things I didn't like was the constant harping by the ministry on the sinful nature of human beings. Like, it didn't speak to me properly, partly because I really didn't understand what it meant, and partly because it seemed, well, sort of, what would you say, was self-flagellating in an unattractive way. I don't know if there is an attractive way to be self-flagellating, but there is. And there was something about it that was also rote and fake that I didn't like. But, in later years, I thought about that more, and I started to understand that there was some real utility in asking people to keep the evil that they're doing clear and conscious in the forefront of their imagination. I think I mentioned to you guys last week that this little episode from what we know of Mesopotamian culture surrounding the emperor, the New Year's festival, they would take the emperor outside of the walled city and strip him of his garb so that he was reduced to just an ordinary man, and then humiliate him ritually, and then ask him how it was over the last year that he wasn't a spectacular embodiment of Marduk. And Marduk was the Mesopotamian deity who made order out of chaos, essentially. And the emperor was supposed to sit and think, okay, well, I'm emperor and everything. I should be doing a good job. Maybe I should even be doing a great job. And probably I'm coming up short in a bunch of ways. And that actually happens to be important since I'm running the entire show. I should be very, very cognizant of how I'm failing to live up to the ideal. And that is what that call, that constant clarion call that's degenerated, I would say, in institutional Christianity, that was actually the idea was, look, there's a bunch of ways that you're not being everything you could be.
And that's what I meant when I opened this with sinning. There are millions of ways that we are not being everything that we could be. There are millions of ways that we are falling short of the mark. And to fall short of the mark is to sin. So yeah, I agree. Great rule to live by, Floki. Yeah, but it's so easy to fall short of that. And to fall short of the mark is to sin. And that's all it means. And so, but if you're in charge of a lot, even if you're not in charge, but these things multiply and ripple out. And if you're the leader of the nation, they really ripple out.
And it is not supposed to be a whip to knock you down, although maybe it's a whip to knock down your pride, the pride that stops you from being aware of your insufficiencies. It's more like a call to the opposite. It's like,
yes,
well, you should stop doing those things because you could be so much more than you are, and that would be so much better for you and everyone else, that it's just not good that you continue doing these things, continue breaking your own rules, let's say.
Yep.
Because we could certainly, as I said, we could start this game by assuming that you should at least play the game that you're playing straight. And it is the case that if you watch yourself, it's a terrifying thing to do, but if you watch yourself, you'll see you lie a lot. Like when I learned this to begin with, I was in my 20s, and I'm a smart person. And
in his 20s.
I was very proud of that. I was also a small person. I was moved ahead one year in school, and I was a small person to begin with. And so I was a very small person in my classes, and also very mouthy, which might not come as much of a surprise, and somewhat provocative. And so, and I got pushed around a fair bit because everybody gets pushed around, and my weapon was to be mouthy, and it was a fairly effective weapon, although it tended to backfire because, if you're really effectively mouthy with large, obnoxious people, then they tend to respond in a relatively negative physical way. And so that sort of thing was happening to me a fair bit. But I was quite proud of the fact that I had some intellectual power. And that it was then in my 20s when I learned about some of the danger of that, because I started to read partly Milton's Paradise Lost, and I started to understand the danger of the intellect. And the danger of the intellect, as far as I can tell, is that it tends towards pride and arrogance. and it also tends to fall in love with its own productions. And so that's actually Lucifer in Paradise Lost. That's Lucifer. Lucifer is the intellect that falls in love with its own productions and then assumes that there's nothing outside of what it thinks. That's the totalitarian mentality, right? It's like we have a total system and we know how everything works, and we're going to implement it, and that'll bring about heaven on earth, right? That's the totalitarian mindset, and that's associated with intellectual arrogance. And at the same time, another thing was happening to me. So I was noticing that. I started to understand what that meant. And I also started to understand that there was more to life than the intellect, much more. Because I smoked too much and I drank too much and I weighed like 130 pounds. I wasn't in good physical shape. And like I had a lot of things to do when I went to graduate school to put myself together. And at the same time, I was trying to understand why things had gone so crazily wrong with the world, its encapsulation in the Cold War, and what role I might be playing in that, if any, or what role any of us were playing in that. At the same time, I was working at a prison, only a little bit. I worked with this crazy psychologist. He used to put jokes on his multiple choice tests. He was a really eccentric guy, but I really liked his courses. He taught a course on creativity, and he was also a prison psychologist. And he was an eccentric guy, and he, for some reason, liked me, and maybe because I was eccentric too. And he invited me to go out to the Edmonton maximum security prison with him a couple of times, which I did. And that was a very interesting experience because I was trying to figure out,
I bet,
what role each individual's behavior bore to the pathology of the group. It was something like that. And I went out there and I met a little guy, smaller than me. I was a little bigger by then. And he was a pretty innocuous guy. And what had happened was I was out in this gymnasium.
This is a good story.
It looks like a high school, a prison, which is really quite telling in my estimation. And there were all these like monsters in there weightlifting, and like they were monsters. I remember one guy was tattooed everywhere, and he had like a huge scar running down the middle of his chest. It looked like somebody had hit him with an axe, and and I was in there, and I had this weird cape that I used to wear that I bought in Portugal, and some boots that went along with it. And yeah, it was like an 1890s Sherlock Holmes cape, and it was really like it was from the 1890s because this little village was up on a hill. It was a walled city on a hill, and they sold these things, and I don't think they've changed the style since 1890. And so I thought they were really cool, and so I was wearing that, which wasn't perhaps the most conservative garb to don if you're going to go to a maximum security prison. So, anyways, I was in the gymnasium, and the psychologist left, and God only knows. I mean, that's what he was like, and all these guys came around me, and they were offering to trade their prison clothes for my cape. And it was like I was being made an offer I couldn't refuse, and so I didn't really know what to do. And then this little guy said something like, the psychologist sent me to come and take you away or something like that. And so I thought, well, better this little guy than all these monsters. So we went outside the gym, through some doors, like school doors. We went outside the gym into the exercise yard, I guess. And we were wandering along, and he was talking to me, and he seemed like a kind of an innocuous guy. And then the psychologist showed up at the door and motioned us back, and so, which was kind of a relief. And so I went into his office, and he said, "You know that guy that you walked out in the yard with?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, he took two cops one night, and he had them kneel down, and while they were begging for their lives, he shot them both in the back of the head. And I thought, see, the thing that was so interesting was that he was so innocuous.
Yes.
Right? Because what you'd hope is that someone like that would be very much unlike you, let's say, and certainly wouldn't be like someone innocuous that you'd met. What you'd want is that the guy would be like, half werewolf and half vampire. So you could just tell right away that he was a cold-blooded killer. But no, he was this sort of ineffectual little guy who was certainly not ineffectual if you gave him a revolver and the upper hand.
Right.
And so that made me think a lot about the relationship between being innocuous and being dangerous. And then another thing happened. I met another guy out there, and then a week or two later, I heard that he and a friend of his had held another guy down, and pulverized his left leg with a lead pipe, like just pulverized it. And the reason for that was that they thought that he was a snitch, and maybe he was. And that time I did something different. Instead of being shocked and horrified by that, although I certainly was, I thought, how in the world could you do that? Because I didn't think I could do that. Eh? I didn't think that, I thought that there was a qualitative distinction between me and those people. And so I spent about 2 weeks trying to see if I could figure out under what conditions I could do that. Like what kind of psychological transformation I would have to undergo to be able to do that. And so that was a meditative exercise, let's say. And it only took about 10 days for me to realize that not only could I do that, that it would be a hell of a lot easier than I thought it would be.
Yes.
And that's sort of where that wall between me and what Jung described as the shadow started to fall apart.
Yeah.
And that also was very useful because I started to treat myself as a somewhat different entity because I hadn't been aware up to that point, because I thought I was a good guy. And there's no reason for me to think that, because you're not a good guy unless you really made a bloody effort to be a good guy. You're just not. It's not easy. And so you're probably a moderately bad guy. And that's a long ways from being an absolutely horrible guy, but it's also a long ways from being a good guy. And so,
yep.
But I had a little more respect for myself after that, because I also understood that there was a monstrous element to the human psyche that you needed to respect. And that was part of you, that you should regard yourself in some sense as a loaded weapon. It's very useful around children to regard yourself as a loaded weapon, because around children you are a loaded weapon.
Mm-hmm.
And the terrible experiences that many children have with their parents are testament to that.
Yes.
Anyways, about the same time, and I don't exactly know how these things were causally related. I guess it was because I was trying to figure out who I was and how that could be fixed, something like that. I started to pay very careful attention to what I was saying. I don't know if that happened voluntarily or involuntarily, but I could feel a sort of split developing in my psyche. And the split, and I've actually had students tell me the same thing that has happened to them after they've listened to some of the material that I've been describing to all of you. But I split into two, let's say. And one part was the old me that was talking a lot and that liked to argue and that liked ideas. And there was another part that was watching that part, like just with its eyes open and neutrally judging. And the part that was neutrally judging was watching the part that was talking and going, that isn't your idea. You don't really believe that. You don't really know what you're talking about. That isn't true. I thought, that's really interesting. So now, and that was happening to like 95% of what I was saying. And so then I didn't really know what to do. I thought, okay, this is
95%.
I fragmented, and that's just not a good thing at all. I mean, it wasn't like I was hearing voices or anything like that. I mean, it wasn't like that. It was, well, people have multiple parts. So then I had this weird conundrum. It was like, well, which of these two things are me? Is it the part that's listening and saying, no, that's rubbish, that's a lie, you're doing that to impress people, you're just trying to win the argument, Was that me, or was the part that was going about my normal verbal business me? And I didn't know, but I decided I would go with the critic. And then what I what I learned to do, I think, was to stop saying things that made me weak. And now I'm still trying to do that, because I'm always feeling when I talk whether or not the words that I'm saying are either making me align or making me come apart. And I think the alignment, I really do think the alignment is the right way of conceptualizing it, because I think if you say things that are as true as you can say them, let's say, then they come out of the depths inside of you. Because we don't know where thoughts come from. We don't know how far down into your substructure the thoughts emerge. We don't know what processes of physiological alignment are necessary for you to speak from the core of your being. We don't understand any of that. We don't even conceptualize that, but I believe that you can feel that. And I learned some of that from reading Carl Rogers, by the way, who's a great clinician, because he talked about mental health in part as a coherence between the spiritual or the abstract or the physical, that the two things were aligned. And there's a lot of idea of
Sorry, guys, I've got firecrackers going on here, so the doggy has become very distressed. It is almost 9 o'clock. I didn't take our break at our halfway mark, so I'm going to put on some of the where is it? It's there. All right. Yes, Sam. Yes, I'm going to put on some music so we can all take a bathroom break. And I'm going to deal with little doggy here, who is now very distressed because he is hearing noises outside. So we will be right back. Oh, yes, doggy.
Bite off a little more than you can chew, you get stronger. And you do that in the gym. For example, when you go lift weights that are a little heavier all the time. And as a consequence, you develop yourself physically and you turn into who you could be. You turn into more than you are. There's a mythological trope that I discuss fairly frequently about rescuing your father from the belly of the dragon or the belly of the beast. We see it in The Lion King. You see it when Simba is being initiated by the baboon, and he ends up contemplating himself in a dark pool, and then his father appears in the sky. And then in the Pinocchio story, he's trying to become a genuine human being instead of a marionette pulled by other people's strings, or a liar, or a jackass, because those are his alternate destinies. He goes down to the darkest place he can find, the bottom of the ocean, and finds the biggest monster he can look at, and inside he finds his father, and then rescues him. The question is, why do you find your father when you look into the abyss? Imagine someone's pursuing a goal. Some of the things they have to accomplish or confront on the way to that goal frighten them, and they start to avoid, and then they get more afraid, and their ability to pursue their goal or to accomplish the goal deteriorates because they're avoiding. If you're a psychotherapist or even a friend or a supportive loved one, you're going to encourage the person to face the challenges that are making them afraid, to face them voluntarily. What happens as a consequence of that is that the person usually is able to overcome those fears and develop the necessary skill and to prevail. That's partly because, not so much because they get less afraid, but because they get more skilled and more courageous. If you bite off a little more than you can chew, you get stronger as a consequence. And you do that in the gym, for example, when you go lift weights that are a little heavier all the time. And as a consequence, you develop yourself physically and you turn into who you could be. You turn into more than you are. Okay, so if you face fears a little bit at a time, fears and challenges, and you do that voluntarily, then you become more than you are. Okay, now let's recast that in archetypal language and make it into a kind of argument. If you want to become everything that you could be, then you look into the abyss itself, which is the darkest place that you can possibly contemplate. The terror of mortality and insanity and of suffering and of malevolence, all of those would be like looking into hell, I suppose. And then by voluntarily doing that, you call upon the strongest part of yourself to respond. And the strongest part of yourself is symbolized as the sleeping father nested inside the beast. It's like an answer to Nietzsche's conundrum. If you look long enough into an abyss, then the abyss looks into you. It's like, well, if you look long enough into an abyss, past when the abyss looks into you, you see who you could become in the form of the great ancestral figures nested inside the catastrophe of life. Then you can join them. You can incorporate that and become stronger. And none of that's going to happen without the demand that's placed on you by willing to confront the full terror of life, the reality of suffering and death, the ever-looming presence of malevolence in your own heart and in the heart of other people. So it's evil and suffering. If you do it forthrightly, then you discover who you could be as a consequence, and who you could be is the solution to malevolence and suffering. Brilliant conceptualization that inside the darkest place is the heroic ancestor whose identity you could incorporate. Perfect. It's perfect. And I really believe it's true. It's what it does. It says that the human being is actually stronger than the greatest challenge that can be set before him or her.
All right. Hey, Christina J is with us. Yay! So Mary Lou also had to go home. So we are going to switch back to... Going to stop that screen, and we're going to share the screen that has the biblical studies. We'll go back to that. So here we are. And yeah, good to have you here, Christina. So let's go big screen and boom.
In psychoanalytic and clinical thinking. But anyways, I decided that I would start practicing not saying things that would make me weak. And what happened was that I had to stop saying almost everything that I was saying. I would say 95% of it. It's a hell of a shock to wake up, and I mean, this was over a few months, but it's a hell of a shock to wake up and realize that you're mostly dead wood.
That's the next song.
You know, and you might think, well, do you really want all of that to burn off? It's like, well, there's nothing left but a little husk, 5% of you. It's like, well, if that 5% is solid,
right,
then maybe that's exactly what you want to have happen. Well, so I told you that story is an elaboration of this line. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. It's a question worth asking. Just exactly what are your motives? Well, you know, maybe they're purer than mine were, and it's certainly possible. I don't think that I'm naturally a particularly good person. I think I have to work at it very, very hard. And I don't...
Most of us do. Most of us like to think that we are good people. But the truth is that we have to work at it very, very hard. Most of us don't get tested as far as doing good versus evil. Most of the time, we are up to our own devices and it doesn't matter. But when it comes down to a hard choice between good and evil, most of us have to work at being good. Most of us have to work at holding our tongue and not saying something nasty online, especially online, you know. And I don't think Jordan Peterson is alone in making that observation. You know, we aren't naturally good. We come out of the womb as little terrorists. You know, if you've ever dealt with a child, you know how much their minds are up to no good. You know, and that doesn't go away simply as a consequence of getting more years under your belt, going around the sun more times. It doesn't happen naturally. It's something that we have to work at. getting our aim on center, not missing the mark, not sinning is something we really, really have to work at. And it's very, very hard. So I like that he says this, that he doesn't think, Jordan Peterson, of all people, doesn't think that he's a naturally good guy. And most people admire him, most, especially among the Jordan Peterson fans. We admire him as one of the best people out there. And even he thinks he has to work at being good. That is really saying something. Really is, which is why I paused it.
I don't necessarily think that everyone is like that. But some people are worse than that. And everyone's like that to some degree.
Yes, Christina, yes.
So it's worth thinking about. Just how much trouble are you trying to cause? And the other thing you might think about is that if you're not doing something important with your life, by your own definition, because that's the game that we're playing, you get to define the terms,
right,
at least initially. Maybe you're prone to cause trouble just because you don't have anything better to do. Because at least trouble is more interesting than boring.
Yes.
That's something you learn if you read Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky knew that extraordinarily well. And so if you're not doing something, if you're not pushing yourself to the limits of your capacity, then you have plenty of leftover, what would you say, willpower, energy, and resources to devote to causing interesting trouble. So, also I would say this is also an archetypal scenario. God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually.
Oof.
That's something to meditate on.
Yeah.
And it's not self-destructive, because what it is an attempt to, it's like the diagnosis of an illness. It's like if that does happen to be the case for you, or to some degree, maybe it's only 10% of you or something, or maybe it's 90%, well then coming to terms with that is excellent, because then maybe you can stop doing it. And what would be the downside to that?
Yeah. And how many people today would come to that same conclusion? Looking at the state of the world, would you say that most people are hell-bent on doing evil all of the time? What percentage of that would you say is true of the world now? Shaman says we will be tested before we realize we've been tested. Yep. Shaman said he typed it at the same time as Christina had her comment about external forces test you constantly. Absolutely. And sometimes they're internal forces as well. Sometimes our own, self-pity. That's a big one. That's a big one that can cause people to be selfish, to do the wrong thing because they want self-gratification, that they're feeling so sorry for themselves that, screw the rules, screw what I know is right. I want mine, So internally and externally, these things come up and they test us. They absolutely do test us. But if you were to say, is the world good or evil today? A lot of people would lean towards, there's a lot of evil in the world. And if God were to etch a sketch us tomorrow, we would be like, yep, I saw it coming.
You'd have to give up your resentment, obviously, and your hatred and all of that. And that's really annoying, because those emotions are they're easy to engage in, and they're
Yes.
engaging. And
Yes.
they have this feeling of self-righteousness with them, and
Self-righteousness
that goes along with them. But you're not doing this in order to put yourself down. You're doing this in order to separate the wheat from the chaff, and to leave everything that you don't have to be behind.
Yep.
And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart.
Oh.
And the Lord said, I will destroy man, whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air. For it repenteth me that I have made them. What's the idea? Well, the idea is that the cosmos that God created had become corrupt. And that's a funny thing, because, this is the other thing about Genesis that always hits me, is that that's also true. I told you that the Mesopotamians believed that human beings were made out of the blood of Kingu, who was the worst monster that the dragon of chaos could imagine. That's a pretty harsh diagnosis. But the reason the Mesopotamians believed that is because they knew, as did the authors of Genesis, that human beings are the only creatures in the cosmos, let's say, the cosmos of being, who are actually capable of deceit, conscious deceit and malevolence. And the question is,
that's not wholly true. Okay, so I'm gonna bring up Christina's comment, and then we're gonna talk about this. Christina says, I do find myself apologizing to the good Lord for wallowing in those less attractive emotions, sometimes a little more often than I'd like. You're not alone, sister. You are not alone. But Jordan's statement here that human beings are the only creatures that are capable of conscious deceit, that's not true. We know that not only do other simians, apes, monkeys, and the like, not only do they lie, and on purpose, like they have the word for snake. And if one of the monkeys finds an egg, which is just an absolute treasure trove of nutrients, usually that egg goes to the alpha in the group. But a lower caste monkey will call out the word for snake, and all the other monkeys will scramble up into the trees. That monkey knows he's lying, because what he's doing is he's saying the code word snake so that everybody runs away and he can get the egg. And we've caught this on tape, so we know about it. We also know that dolphins will lie and gossip about other dolphins. They've done the research on this. And anybody who's owned a dog or a cat knows that both of them will lie for food. They will act like they have never been fed ever in their lives. You know, you will just have given them a treat and they'll say, no, I didn't have a treat. It's time to give me another. Yeah. So humans are not the only ones who can lie. But at the time of the writing of the Bible, they didn't have, the kind of animal studies that we have now to know that this happens among other species as well. So, but it's still, it goes to stand. Lying is something that the complexity with which we can lie is definitely beyond any other species. Let's put it that way.
To what degree does the expression of that conscious deceit and malevolence corrupt things so badly that it would be better that they didn't exist at all? Well, you see stories. There's a story associated with this in the Epic of Gilgamesh, associated with the flood, that has exactly the same underlying narrative structure. In fact, some people think the story of Noah was derived from it, where the gods who created repented of their creation and determined that erasing it would be better than allowing it to propagate.
Yeah.
And you see the same thing in the Mesopotamian creation of the Enuma Elish, because the early gods, so they're representatives of the giants of humanity, I would say, make so much noise and are so careless that the original creator god, Tiamat, and her consort, Tiamat, decides to wipe them from the face of the earth.
Yeah.
And so when you read something like this, if you read it from an informed historical perspective, it starts to have a depth that makes it transcend the sort of archaic and fairy tale-like element of the story. It's like, I've read some very terrible things about what happened in Nazi Germany and what happened when the Japanese invaded China and just what happened generally in the history of mankind. And things can get so bad that it takes the imagination of a very bad person to conceptualize them. And when they get that bad, this is the only kind of language that works to describe them. That's another thing that I've discovered working with my clinical clients, is that when their lives are really not going well, when they're close to suicide, or when they're close to homicide, or when there are things going on in the family that are so corrupt and terrible that they reach back generations and they're aimed at nothing but misery and destruction, the only language that suffices has a religious tone. because there's nothing else that's available to describe what's happening with the proper level of seriousness. And it might be that you've never encountered a situation that required that level of seriousness, but that doesn't mean that those situations don't exist. They exist.
Yep.
You generally do everything you can to avoid being ensconced in them, but they certainly do exist, and the probability that you'll encounter a situation like that or two at some point in your life is extraordinarily high. You'll tangle with someone who's malevolent right to the core, and maybe it'll be you that is, and that'll be a big shock. And then these sorts of things, these sorts of poetic descriptors start to become much more real. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. That's an interesting line, because if you remember back in the story of Adam and Eve, what happens to Adam once he eats the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and wakes up, the scales fall from his eyes, becomes self-conscious, develops the knowledge of good and evil, is he won't walk with God when God calls him in the garden.
Yep.
And so Noah is Adam without the fall, essentially. And there's something that Noah's doing right that motivates God to spare him, or maybe to show him a pathway through the emergent chaos, something like that. And that's worth thinking about a lot, because there will be situations in your life where what you face is the emergent chaos. And maybe that'll be some terrible catastrophe inside your family, or maybe it'll be something that's occurring on a much broader social level. But the chaos is coming. And what you're going to want to know, unless you want to be a denizen of the chaos or even a contributor to it, and perhaps that is what you want, because many people under those circumstances choose that.
Antifa.
What you want is to know how you build an ark and get through it.
Yeah.
That's what you, if you're interested in life, if you're interested in proper being, and you're disinclined to produce any more suffering than necessary, then you want to know how to conduct yourself when the catastrophe comes, so that you have a reasonable possibility of
getting the hell out,
of moving through it and starting anew. So when this old story says, well, God's not happy and he's going to wipe everything out, it's like, well, you might want to take that seriously.
Yeah.
And then when it says, but there's one person who had a mode of being that protected him from that, that's also something you might want to take seriously, because you might want to know what that mode of being is, because you might need to use it. And so these sorts of things are practical in the deepest possible sense. They're real in the deepest possible sense, and practical in the deepest possible sense. So Noah walked with God. Now I'm going to switch way ahead here, because I said at the beginning of the lecture series that the Bible is a hyperlinked text, and everything refers to everything else. And so there's utility in reading it in linear order, but it's not a linear document. It's a document that you can move through in an infinite number of, there's an infinite number of pathways that you can use to walk through it. And all of the document expands upon and refers to all of the rest of the document. And so I'm going to switch to the Sermon on the Mount, which I think is probably the key document in the New Testament. And I'm going to switch to it because I think it's the closest thing we have to a fully articulated description of what it would mean to walk with God so that you're in the ark when the flood comes. It's the most fully articulated realization of that idea that leaps out of the metaphorical. Because if I say, well, you should conduct yourself like Noah and walk with God and build an ark, obviously those are poetic and metaphorical suggestions, and it's not that easy to bring them into practice, right? It's the distance. There's a big distance between you and the archetype. It isn't obvious how to manifest it in your own life. And what has to happen is the archetype has to be differentiated and articulated so that it becomes sufficiently practical and personal so that you can actually implement it. So I'm going to take apart some of the Sermon on the Mount.
Sorry about my lack of engagement in this part of the Peterson commentary. If you can't see right now, I have a giant doggy on my lap. Mary Lou left, and he's very scared of the firework noises that came about earlier. So he has been climbing up in my lap and on onto this very small space that I have between my chair and the camera. So yeah, we say a quick prayer for the doggy. Yeah, that's a good boy. Everything's gonna be all right. You're gonna be all right. You're safe. So, but yeah, poor puppers. All right, here we go. Sermon on the Mount.
Starts in Matthew 5, and I'm not going to talk about Matthew 5. I'm going to talk about the end of Matthew 6 and most of Matthew 7. Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They toil not, neither do they spin. And yet I say unto you, that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Wherefore, if God so clothe the grass of the field, which today is, and tomorrow is cast into the oven, shall he not much more clothe you, O ye of little faith? Therefore take no thought, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or wherewithal shall we be clothed? Those are famous lines, and that's sort of Christ the hippie.
Yeah, right.
It's like, hey, let it all hang out. That's an old phrase. Do your thing, and everything will come to you. And these lines have been interpreted in that manner many times. But that's seriously not the proper interpretation, because there's a kicker with this injunction. And the kicker is this. For your heavenly Father knows that you have need of all these things. But seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. That's a lot different than the hippie thing.
Yes.
Right? Because there's a very, very, very interesting idea here. It's certainly one of the most profound ideas that I've ever encountered.
The kingdom of God first.
And the idea is this, is that if you configure your life so that what you are genuinely doing is aiming at the highest possible good, then the things that you need to survive and to thrive on a day-to-day basis will deliver themselves to you.
Yes.
That's a hypothesis. And it's not some simple hypothesis, right? Because what it basically says is, if you dare to do the most difficult thing that you can conceptualize, your life will work out better than it will if you do anything else.
Yes.
Well, how are you going to find out if that's true? Well, it's a Kierkegaardian leap of faith. There's no way you're going to find out whether or not that's true unless you do it.
Right.
So no one can tell you either, because just because it works for someone else, I mean, that's interesting and all that, but it's no proof that it'll work for you. You have to be all in this game. And so the idea is, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. It's like, that's actually a fairly important caution when you're talking about not having to pay attention to what you're going to eat or what you're going to wear.
Yes.
So what it's essentially saying is that those problems are trivial in comparison. And the probability is that if you manifest yourself properly in the world, that those things will come your way is extraordinarily high. And I believe that that's exactly right. I mean,
so, and the other thing is, you have to consider back in these days, the way that sentences were constructed. The most important bit was at the end, because they didn't have microphones and other things like that. So the way that Latin was constructed in order to give speeches, the orators, the great orators of Rome and stuff like that. And the things that would echo in the hall were the last things that you said. So in here in the Bible, it's not the first part of the sentence, which, in our modern language that we would understand to be the most important. It's not the first thing you say, it's the last thing that's said. So the seeking the kingdom of God first is what's more important than worrying about what you're wearing, where you're going to get food, all that other kind of stuff. So it's one of those things that kind of makes the Bible difficult to read sometimes, because our modern minds aren't geared the same way as the people who authored it. But that's one of the things that's going on here.
I've watched people operate in the world, and I would say that There is no more effective way of operating in the world than to conceptualize the highest good that you can and then strive to attain it. There's no more practical pathway to the kind of success that you could have if you actually knew what success was.
Bingo.
And so that's what this sermon is attempting to posit. It's
and Shaman says here, manifest yourself properly in this world and better things will come your way. That's epic. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's what Jordan Peterson talks about in his 12 rules for life, you know, manifest yourself properly in the world and everything else will fall into place.
It's like in the story of Pinocchio, you know, what happens at the beginning of the story of Pinocchio is that Geppetto wishes on a star. We talked about that a little bit. And so what Geppetto does is align himself with the metaphorical manifestation of the highest good he can conceptualize.
Yep.
And he makes a commitment, let's say. He aims at the star. And for him, the star is the possibility that he can take his creation, a puppet, right, whose strings are being pulled by unseen forces, and have it transform into something that's autonomous and real.
Yes.
Well, that's a hell of an ambition. You know, and we're wise enough to put that in the children's movie, but too foolish to understand what it means. It's such an interesting juxtaposition that we can both know that and not know it at the same time.
Right.
You can go to the movie, you can watch it, and it makes sense. But that doesn't mean that you can go home and think, well, I know what that meant. Well, people are complicated, right? We exist at different levels, and all the levels don't communicate with one another. But the movie is a hypothesis, and the hypothesis is there's no better pathway to self-realization and the ennoblement of being than to posit the highest good that you can conceive of and commit yourself to it.
Bingo.
You might also ask yourself, and this is definitely worth asking, is do you really have anything better to do? And if you don't, well, why would you do anything else?
Mic drop.
Therefore, take no thought for the morrow, for the morrow shall take thought for the things of itself. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. I spent a long time trying to figure out what that meant too, because it's another one of those lines that can easily be read as pro-grasshopper and anti-ant. You know, you remember the old fable of the grasshopper and the ant? Maybe not. I'm not going to tell it, but the ant works and the grasshopper fiddles, and the ant has a pretty good time in the winter and the grasshopper dies. And so this is like a pro-grasshopper line, but it's not, because it says something else. It says that if you orient yourself properly and then pay attention to what you do every day, that works.
Yep.
And I actually think that that's in accordance with what we have come to understand about human perception, because what happens is that the world shifts itself around your aim. Because you're a creature that has an aim. You have to have an aim in order to do something. You're an aiming creature. You look at a point and you move towards it. It's built right into you. And so you have an aim. Well, let's say your aim is the highest possible aim. Well, then, so that sets up the world around you. It organizes all of your perceptions. It organizes what you see and you don't see. It organizes your emotions and your motivations. So you organize yourself around that aim. And then what happens is the day manifests itself as a set of challenges and problems. And if you solve them properly, then you stay on the pathway towards that aim. And you can concentrate on the day. And so that way you get to have your cake and eat it too. Because you can point into the distance, the far distance.
Yep.
And you can live in the day.
Yep.
And it seems to me that makes every moment of the day supercharged with meaning. That's how, because if everything that you're doing every day is related to the highest possible aim that you can conceptualize, well, that's the very definition of the meaning that would sustain you in your life. Well, and then the issue is, well, back to Noah. Well, all hell's about to break loose and chaos is coming. It's like when that's happening in your life, you might want to be doing something that you regard as truly worthwhile. Because that's what will keep you afloat when everything is flooded. And you don't want to wait until the flood comes to start doing that, because if your ark's half built and you don't know how to captain it, the probability is very high that that you'll drown.
Brilliant.
Take therefore no thought for the morrow, but for the morrow shall take thought for the things of itself. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. That's not a particularly optimistic formulation. Judge not, that ye be not judged. For with what judgment you judge, you shall be judged, and with what measure you meet, it shall be measured to you again. It's a sensible description. I wouldn't call it a piece of advice, because I don't think that any of this is advice. It's a description of the structure of reality. That's not the same as advice.
Yes.
And it basically says that you'll be held accountable by the rules of the game that you choose to play.
Yes.
And that, I also think, is perfectly in keeping with what we understand about human psychology, because you have to play a game that other people will allow you to play, and that will cooperate with you while you're playing it, will compete with you while you're playing it. But you have a fair bit of flexibility in setting up the parameters of the game, but you don't have any choice about whether or not you're going to be in a game. You're in a game, and you're going to be held accountable by the rules of the game, because that's how the game works. And so you might want to pick a game by whose rules you would be willing to be held accountable. And why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye?
Yep.
Or how will you say to thy brother, let me pull out the mote out of thine eye, and behold, a beam is in thine own eye? Well, you might be wondering what a beam is. And a mote is a dust speck, and a beam is a very large piece of lumber. And so the issue is not so much the blindness of others, even though there's as much blindness among others as there is for you. But the issue here, the advice here, the description here is, you should be concerned about what's interfering with your own vision first. And you should leave other people the hell alone in relationship to that. And
don't be a Karen, in other words. How many times is the Karen acting worse than the person that she's criticizing?
So if your mode of being in the world is, if you would just act better, things would improve for me, or if you identify the evil and the catastrophe as something that's outside, that someone else needs to fix, or that someone else is responsible for, then you're not going to fix that.
Yeah.
And you're going to remain blind to the things that you're doing and not doing that make things not go well.
Yep.
And so it's just better to think, all right, I'm probably blind in many, many ways. And maybe there are some ways that I could rectify that, because it's highly probable that you're blind in all sorts of ways. I mean, it's in fact, it's virtually certain. And so it's just more useful to think, how is it that I'm wrong in this situation? I'll tell you something that I learned to do when I was arguing with my wife, which happened quite frequently, because when you actually communicate with people, you find out that there's many things that you don't agree on. And that's because you're actually different creatures.
Yep.
So if you're actually going to have a truthful conversation, then you're going to find out that you don't see things the same way. And then you can either pretend that that's not the case and gloss over it, and then end up in a 30-year silent war, or you can have the damn fight when you need to have it and see if you can straighten it out. So now and then we'd get in a situation where we were at loggerheads, we couldn't move. And, it would spiral up into hate speech, let's say. Yeah, everyone laughs because they know they manifest plenty of hate speech towards those they love. So one of the things we learned to do was, when we hit an impasse, was to separate and to go our own ways, and to go sit and think, okay, look, we're at this unpleasant situation. We can't figure out how to move forward.
Yeah.
I'd always think, of course it's her fault. Obviously it's her fault. At least 95%. But maybe there was something I did that contributed like 5% to it. And so I would sit and think and ask myself a question, which was, is there anything I did in the last 6 months that increased the probability that this impasse would manifest itself? And I'll tell you, you have no idea how fast your mind will generate an answer to a question like that. Because
Yes.
there's undoubtedly some idiotic thing that you did, that you know, that you remember, that increased the probability that you're going to have your hands around the throat of the person that you love. And then you can go tell them that. And then you can have a conversation, especially if they do the same thing. Say, look, you know, here's how I'm an idiot in this situation. The other person says, well, yeah, here's how I'm an idiot. And then you're two idiots, and then maybe you can have a conversation. So, thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam out of thine own eye, and then shalt thou see clearly to cast out the mote of thy brother's eye. That's, hey, hard to argue with that.
Yep.
Ask and it shall be given you. Seek and ye shall find. Knock and it shall be opened unto you. For everyone that asketh receiveth, and he that seeketh findeth, and to him that knocketh it shall be opened. That sounded pretty optimistic again. But again, I think it's a description of the structure of existential reality. And by which I mean, when I'm in my clinical practice and I observe, and this is also the case with my students, is let's say, people's lives aren't what they would like them to be. And so then you ask, why? Well, forget about tragedy and catastrophe, because that's self-evident, and we're not going to discuss that. Although the degree to which you bring about your own tragedy is always indeterminate. But
Right.
I would never say that every terrible thing that is visited on a person is something they deserved. I think that that's a very dangerous presupposition, especially because everyone gets sick and everyone dies.
Bingo.
But one of the main reasons that people don't get what they want is because they don't actually figure out what it is. And the probability that you're going to get what would be good for you, let's say, which would even be better than what you want, right? Because you might be wrong about what you want easily. But maybe you could get what would really be good for you. Well, why don't you? Well, because you don't try. You don't think, okay, here's what I would like if I could have it. And I don't mean in a way that you manipulate the world to force it to deliver you goods for status or something like that. That isn't what I mean. I mean something like, imagine that you were taking care of yourself like you were someone you actually cared for. And then you thought, okay, I'm caring for this person. I would like things to go as well for them as possible. What would their life have to be like in order for that to be the case? Well, people don't do that. They don't sit down and think, all right, let's figure it out. You've got a life. It's hard, obviously. It's like 3 years from now, you can have what you need. You got to be careful about it. You can't have everything. You can have what would be good for you, but you have to figure out what it is, and then you have to aim at it. Well, my experience with people has been if they figure out what it is that would be good for them, and then they aim at it, then they get it. And that's strange because they don't it's a strange thing. It's not quite that simple because, you may formulate an idea about what would be good for you, and then you take 10 steps towards that, and you find out that your formulation was a bit off, and so you have to reformulate your goal. So you're kind of going like this as you move towards the goal. But a huge part of the reason that people fail is because they don't ever set up the criteria for success. And so since success is a very narrow line and very unlikely, the probability that you're going to stumble on it randomly is zero.
And I'm going to end this with something that and hello, Rex. It's good to see you. Haven't seen you in a while. Well, so you always come in. I don't get enough time with you. Let's put it that way. I'd like to see you more, but welcome. And we're about to end, but I was late, so that's going to be the thing. And Okie Kevin Edwards is here too. Yay, showing up late. You guys got to sit at the front of the class next time. The autopilot. If you think about autopilot of a plane, it doesn't just aim at where it's going and then go there. It's constantly having to adjust. And that's part of what he's talking about here. And that is, a plane on autopilot has to deal with crosswinds, has to deal with pressure changes, all sorts of different things. So it's constantly adjusting where it's going to maintain that, direction towards what it's aiming at. And in the same way, sin being that idea of missing the mark, we're constantly readjusting ourselves and going, okay, that didn't work. I didn't do that exactly right. This could have been done better. And we readjust, just like a plane on autopilot does. We readjust ourselves in order to get at what we're aiming at, get that good thing of our life that would make our life better. And that's the whole concept behind knock and the door shall be opened. And one of the things is that if you go back to the earlier translations, it'll say knock, and either it's implicitly or explicitly said knock and keep knocking. Ask and keep asking. So it's one of those things is aim for it and keep aiming for it. Don't just give up the first time that you stumble across a problem that trips you up. Just keep doing it, keep at it, and you will get there. And so this is something that's definitely a truth, truth with a capital T sort of thing. So but yeah, we are just closing up because and I apologize for starting late, but it allowed us for two of our Pam fam to show up, so I'm so happy about that. Yay. But yeah, if you guys could like on your way out. Sean says fantastic commentary, Pam, spot on. Thank you. It's only because I've done the wrong thing so many times that I finally stumbled on what is correct. Christina says, so glad I caught this. I'm glad you did too. And I'll close with this other thing. And that is, this was from Mythbusters. And it was guy with the mustache. Can't remember his name, and the hat that I'm losing my words right now. Migraine. It is that if you only ever do things right, you're only going through the motions. It's only when you make mistakes that we actually learn. It's only when we get things wrong. It's only when we miss the mark that we learn, oh, this is how I do it correctly. This is Jamie. Thank you. Okay, Evan. I was on the tip of my tongue. Jamie said this. So yeah, if you're always getting things right, you don't know what it is you're doing to make things right. But if you make a mistake, if you get things wrong, that's when you actually learn. When we sin, when we miss the mark, is when we actually learn. And our job is then to, like the plane on autopilot, keep going. Like it said in Matthew here, to keep knocking. And eventually we'll figure it out. We'll get to our destination. We'll be able to hit that bullseye. So, yeah. Logic says, wondering when I'm going to learn, still making mistakes. We're always going to be making mistakes. That's the thing. Because we're always going to be aiming at different things. We're always going to be aiming higher. Once we hit the mark on something, we're on to the next project where, we're green behind the ears and we've got to learn something newer and bigger and better all the time. So don't worry about making mistakes. Learn, just dust yourself off and correct your aim, and you'll get better at doing it. And that's just something that happens with all of us. I'm still making mistakes all the time. I corrected a doctor today. This guy is very learned in his field. He's got more knowledge than I could ever have. And I was correcting his mistakes on a paper he wrote, so none of us is perfect. And it doesn't matter what kind of status you get in society. This doesn't make you immune from making mistakes. And yeah, Christina said it, making mistakes is how you learn. 100%. So don't take sinning, which is the archery term for missing the mark. I'm saying this for the people who came in late. Don't take missing the mark. Don't take sinning as this big, awful, terrible thing that you need to then beat yourself up for. Don't beat yourself up for your mistakes. Go, okay, that was a mistake. Dust myself off. Now, how do I do better next time? How do I hit the mark next time? And that's why we played the More Than Who You Are song at the interlude. You know, what can we do each time to be more than what we were yesterday, to do, you know, just a little bit better than we did the day before. And if you keep at that, if you keep aiming up, keep aiming for the greatest good, then you'll find yourself there. So, all right, guys, I love all of you. Thank you for hanging in. Apologies for being late, and thank you for putting up with the scared doggy. Yeah, I look forward to seeing you all next Thursday. So, love you, Pam. Bye.